Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. I'm Bill Current, founder of the Current Consulting Group. And once again, I'm joined by Brian Feeley, Vice President of the Current Consulting Group. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Bill. Thank you.
And to our audience, this is another episode in our ongoing series on oral fluid testing. Find us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, wherever you look for and watch podcasts. You'll find Currently Speaking there, and we invite you to check out some of our past podcasts and look for notices of upcoming podcasts. You can also go to currentconsultinggroup.com. You'll find information about our archive of webinars, newsletters, and of course, podcasts. We welcome you to visit our website, currentconsultinggroup.com. So for this episode in our ongoing series on oral fluid testing, we're going to talk about the difference between laboratory-based and rapid result oral fluid testing. So, Brian, let's go ahead and get started. This is kind of a basic topic, but I know some of it can be a little bit complex at times when people are dealing with state laws that either allow lab-based oral fluid or they don't allow point of collection or vice versa. And so these issues are important. They come up all the time as companies are putting their programs together. And as oral fluid testing starts to gain in popularity, this is a critically important topic. So give us a sort of a basic rundown of what laboratory oral fluid testing is and then point of collection oral fluid testing.
Sure. Laboratory-based testing has been around for, really since 2000. So it's not new, although it might be new for some people. And the concept is very simple. You have a oral fluid collection device that's used at the point of collection, right? It could be in your offices or in your manufacturing facility or at a clinic. The oral fluid collection device collects an oral fluid sample, and it goes into that device. Many of the ones that are on the market now have a volume indicator that's on the oral fluid swab itself, which is very helpful and actually necessary in the regulated markets. That's one of the requirements. But that oral fluid swab is swabbed around the mouth. Sometimes they're just put under the tongue. And a red dye or a colored dye will appear in the window on the collector. That tells you that you've collected enough oral fluid for the test. Typically, that will then go into a vial and get sealed and, under chain of custody, and will get sent to the laboratory for laboratory testing, just like a urine sample would be tested. So it would arrive at the lab, it would go through the typical chain of custody review and accessioning, and then the lab would put it into the process of screening for whatever the drugs of abuse panel is that you've ordered as part of that test.
So let me interrupt and just say, before we move on to point of collection testing, about how long is that process? I know it probably varies from product to product, but basically how long would it take before you would have a sufficient amount of oral fluid?
Yeah, most of the collection devices require about anywhere from 2 to maybe 5 minutes, depending upon the person's mouth and whether they're a good salivator or whether they might have a little bit of dry mouth from working conditions or from medications they might be on. It could go a little longer, but typically it's in that 2 to 5 minute window that you'll get the dye to show in the window or where the collection is complete. And then the sample's packed up and sent to the lab. And since you asked about time, I'll add this note. The time for the laboratory to test that oral fluid sample and get you the results, if you're talking about a negative, it will probably be reported in 24 hours from the time it arrived at the lab. If the sample screens positive, just like a urine specimen, it will go on for confirmation testing by GC or LC mass spec. And that process can take usually another 24 to 48 hours for the confirmation part to be done. And that's basically how lab-based testing is performed.
So how does that collection process compare to a point of collection or rapid? We see the acronym POCT. What's that stand for, and how is that different?
Yeah, it's I particularly don't necessarily like the term POCT. It doesn't really come from the drugs of abuse space. It really comes more out of the clinical area. And traditionally that POCT means point of care test, right? Where you would be in a hospital setting or in a clinical setting, and they would bring in a glucometer or a test that you would be doing at bedside. That's where POCT came from. And then it sort of got borrowed into the drugs of abuse area. But since it wasn't point of care, some people have adopted point of collection as the test for a rapid test, which to me, I don't necessarily like, because you're not just collecting the test with a rapid or an instant test. You're not just collecting the sample, you're actually doing the entire test. So I prefer instant or rapid test for those drugs of abuse tests that are done right there on the spot. Call it an instant test, call it a rapid. Um, People will probably continue to call it POCT anyway, but that's just the way it goes. But the difference is, of course, with a rapid or instant test, you have an oral fluid collection device that's collecting the sample in the same way that you would do, similar way you would do as the lab-based test that we were just talking about. And again, there's typically a volume indicator on that stick of the oral fluid rapid device. And then that sample, once it's adequate, would be put into a cassette, or there would be a way to get that sample out of the sponge of the collector onto a little test cartridge. Tests are formatted a little differently, but essentially within that device that you're using right there on the spot, there's paper. We call it a lateral flow strip, if you will. And on that strip are the different reagents and materials you need to be able to detect a drug of abuse. There'll be a strip for THC and one for cocaine and one for methamphetamine. And typically they're all contained in that compartment or that cassette. And a very common one, Bill, that's on the market, been on the market for a while now, is the oral tox device made by Premier Biotech. Very nice device, easy to use, all contained in one nice vessel, and the collection is actually very easy to do, and the test is very accurate.
So the laboratory-based test is where the initial screen and, if necessary, the confirmation test takes place at the laboratory.
Correct.
With a rapid or instant test, it's actually going to give you a result right on the spot. I mean, about how
Correct.
long typically before you get a result? And then what do you do if the test result is positive or non-negative?
Great question. Yeah, great question. So most of them take somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes for the result to develop on the cassette. The collection process, again, may be 2 or 3 minutes, maybe, up to 5 minutes to get a good oral fluid sample. So add that to the 10-minute time for you. So you're typically looking at maybe somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes to conduct a rapid test like that. If it comes up negative at your site, then you're done. If it comes up positive, or what we call presumptive positive, then that person, that individual, really needs to provide another sample. Well, let me back up. There's 2 ways that a sample can be confirmed in an oral fluid device. I mentioned the oral tox device. That cassette itself still contains the oral fluid sample within the cassette. So they've created a way to take that cassette and actually send it to the laboratory, to Premier Biotech, to have a confirmation test done on that sample. Another way to do it with some of the other devices that are on the market, or even with Premier Biotech Oral Tox, if you prefer to do this, is you would collect another oral fluid sample using one of the lab-based approaches that I mentioned earlier, whether it's Intercept or Quantisol or the products that are on the market for doing lab-based oral fluid testing, and collect another sample and have that sent to the lab to confirm what you saw on the instant test. And that's really important. If you see anything that's presumptively positive, don't take action on that. Get a valid, good oral fluid sample. Either send that oral tox device to Premier, or do a lab-based oral fluid test to get that sample confirmed by GC or LC mass spec.
So if an employer is in a state that has some specific requirements for collecting a specimen, or for example, a split specimen, explain what a split specimen is and how that would work with oral fluid testing.
Sure. So a split specimen for laboratory-based oral fluid testing is, if we're talking non-regulated, of course, because right now we're still waiting for for 2 labs to be certified to do the regulated DOT testing. But traditionally with oral fluid, split specimen can be obtained by doing 2 oral fluid devices. So for years, as I worked at OraSure, as you know, we used the Intercept device, and we had customers that would ask that question: how do I get an A and a B sample? There are certain states that do require that. I believe it might have been Illinois that had in the safety sensitive area, they required a split specimen. And so you would do a left side and a right side. You just take two collectors, one on the left and one on the right, and you both would go into their individual vials, and one would be labeled A and one B. So you'd have that second sample to go to if you needed to do a challenge test. And so we won't get into this in this podcast, but I'll just seed this for a future podcast. We're going to talk a little bit more about DOT and their requirements, the federal versus the DOT devices, because they're a little different in terms of what they specified. But for instant testing, to jump to that for a moment, if you were really trying to do a split specimen, that doesn't really apply to an instant testing mode, because you really are collecting a single sample and you're putting it into a cassette and you're testing a single sample. Where it would come into play is if you had to do a confirmation test. You could, again, use a protocol that would involve collection of two samples, or as the DOT requirement hits, that will automatically be a split specimen and one specimen divided into two, an A and a B sample. So that gets a little confusing. It's a little further down the road, but there are ways to do split specimens. Typically, you would not do that for a point of collection or instant rapid test.
Okay. So there are ways to use oral fluid testing in compliance with state laws that maybe don't mention oral fluid, but have specific collector requirements or confirmation testing, etc. So how does an employer know which method is right for their company, the rapid versus the lab-based, or a hybrid program? I mean, how would they know which one is right for them?
Sure. I'm going to just share my screen real quick here, Bill.
Okay.
Okay, so to answer your question, I just put up a slide that gives you a little bit of a comparison of lab-based versus the rapid oral fluid test. And one of the differences here, of course, with lab-based is you're not getting an immediate result. So you're using it in an application where you're okay with that time period that would be overnight or take a few days. So typically with random or pre-employment testing or those sort of modes where the result is not necessarily, doesn't have to be instantaneous. So a lab-based test is typically going to take 24 to 72 hours. It's all done by the lab. So you're not having to interpret results or do the testing yourself. Typically when you're purchasing that as a buyer, they're bundled together, that screen and the confirmation. There's a long history and to draw from on how lab-based testing works and how it's done. And it's pretty simple, especially with oral fluid. Now, the rapid tests differ in the sense that you're getting an immediate result, right? So you would use that in an application where you really need to make a quick decision. It might be hiring. You've got applicants that are on a job site. You need to get them into to work right away. So that's a great application for a rapid test. You might need something because it was a suspicion or post-accident. You really want to know, do I potentially have a positive situation here? So that, some of the cases there where immediate results really come into play. There are many choices now out there with both FDA cleared and E&I labeled product that we just talked about that on a previous podcast. There are different cutoff levels that can be selected. And so there's some versatility there. And then again, the collections are very simple, just like a lab-based collector. And, again, that instant test result and the ability to hire quickly are probably the key hallmarks of where you would want to use that rapid or instant test.
So I know we've talked about this in previous episodes, but because the oral fluid sample collection process is relatively easy compared to other testing methods, it really does make it possible for employers to do those collections on site or maybe at a job fair, for example, and with oral fluid testing, have a result back in, say, 15 minutes or so, and be able to, with a negative result, offer somebody a job right on the spot. They've got a drug test result back and they're
Correct.
ready to go.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct, Bill. And I would just say from one other point related to oral fluid collections, We first introduced oral fluid collections and testing back in 2000, and the initial thought from people was that it wasn't something they would want to do in their facility. They just, traditionally urine testing all hands off and is done by sending someone to a patient service center and doing a collection and not having any involvement in it. And we started to show people what the oral fluid collection entails, right? And it's a very donor driven process. The company is really not doing the collection. The donor is doing their own collection and sending that to a lab. Even in the case of a point of collection or an instant or rapid test, the donor does the collection and they're really collecting their own sample. So I guess my point is that for those people who are hesitant to think about doing collections in a facility, in a an office space or in a manufacturing area or someplace where you have a little bit of privacy, check it out first. Look at the procedure, and I think you'll find it to be very easy to do. And the time saving and the cost savings that can be realized by doing that in your own facility versus sending someone to a clinic can be pretty substantial. There's still going to be plenty of applications where people just don't want to do it. We see that in real safety sensitive operations in oil and gas and some of those areas. They really just prefer to have a collection site doing that. They're okay with oral fluid, but they want someone else to do it. That's fine too. Lots of versatility to it. And, I think people that try it will really love it.
Yeah, and if you look at the federal guidelines that came out, particularly in October of 2019, when SAMHSA issued final regulations for oral fluid testing of federal employees, they talked about the advantages or the attributes of oral fluid testing that really moved the federal government toward allowing lab-based oral fluid testing. And that was one of them, that the collections were so easy to do that it could save time and money when employers choose to do them on site, even if you have somebody come to your workplace to do it that way. But they're really simple to do. That's why we sometimes, as Brian mentioned, refer to it as a donor-driven drug testing method, and where the collector, quote unquote, is really an observer, and they make sure that the paperwork gets filled out correctly, etc. But it's really donor-driven. Anyways, great information, Brian. Thank you again for providing that. We have a whole series on oral fluid testing featuring Brian talking about various advanced and basic topics. So check out our podcast at Spotify, at YouTube, at Apple, wherever you normally look at podcasts. You'll find episodes of Currently Speaking, and you can also find information at our website, currentconsultinggroup.com. So with that, we'll conclude today's episode, and thank you again, Brian, and thank you everybody for joining us for today's podcast.